Hi, thanks everybody for coming. My name's Laura Snyder, and I'm going to talk to you today about a tale of two immigration. The first immigration is a story about immigration to the United States, and the second story is about immigration from the United States. So I'm going to start with immigration to the United States. And I'm sure that you're thinking, how hard could it have been to immigrate to the United States in the 19th century? Surely it wasn't that hard. And you're right, it wasn't that hard. But once you got there, if you tried to go home again, you might have had some issues. What you saw almost immediately after the founding of the country, you had the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France. And Britain was desperate for soldiers. And they would go to, well, they'd be in American waters even. They would forcibly board American ships. And anyone that they considered to be British, whether they were or not, whether they were American citizens, didn't matter. If they considered you to be British, they were impressing men into the British Navy. And this grew to be such a problem that it was said that at the time, pretty much everybody in the United States either knew or knew of someone who had been impressed into the British Navy. And this didn't end until the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when England didn't need so many soldiers. But that didn't mean that the problem ended. It didn't mean that immigrants from certain countries to the United States were safe from their countries of origin. Because what happened quite often was that when someone returned for a short visit, was intended to be a short visit to their country of origin, they would find themselves, particularly young men, summoned or kidnapped off the street and forced into military service in that country. So what was meant to be a short visit turned out to be a quite lengthy visit. And this was a problem for over 100 years. Basically, young men who had some sort of close enough connection to another country basically weren't safe from their country of origin. And you could ask yourself, what was in the mind of those countries? Why did they think that they had the right to do that to people who, had set up a life in another country, were naturalized U.S. citizens, in some cases were born in the United States, or maybe their parent, particularly their father, was from that other country? And it all boils down to a man named William Blackstone. He in 1765, he was an English jurist. He described what's become the doctrine of perpetual allegiance. Basically, he said, once a British subject, always a British subject. And if you go somewhere else in the world and you live somewhere else in the world, that's your business, but it doesn't affect your obligations to the British Empire. And if we want to conscript you, we're going to conscript you. These are his exact words. This is how I paraphrase him in modern day language. There was a response to that, of course. You had American diplomats who, of course, knew what was going on and didn't like it, expressed themselves. The two that maybe did this the most eloquently, I've quoted here, Charles Faulkner, a U.S. minister to France, and George Yeaman, ambassador to Denmark at the time. This, again, is the exact quotes. If you want to paraphrase it into modern language, this is how I paraphrase it. People should be allowed to leave one country or another without any perspective or future obligations to the country they've left. So what they said was, if you leave Prussia, for example, or France, Italy, and you have you leave as a 20-year-old man and you are subject at that time to military service, well, yes, you should serve that and you should be required to serve that. But if you leave as a 10-year-old and you go back 15 years later for a visit, no, you should not be subject to military service in that country. That's crazy. So the situation really got to be out of hand. And by the end of the Civil War, the Secretary of State wanted to find a solution. And we had a man named George Bancroft, minister to Prussia, who negotiated a series of treaties with a few countries, basically trying to find a solution to the problem. They were called the Bancroft Treaties. Now, the problem itself is relatively narrow. It's people being required to complete a military service in a country where they do not live. But the treaties themselves sought to address what was perceived to be, it was actually a much bigger issue, which was dual nationality. So the first Bancroft treaties didn't even mention military service. Instead, what they did was they said, that when one person moves from one country to another, it establishes the conditions under which they would automatically lose the citizenship of the country that they left. It would happen automatically by operation of the treaty. The person involved didn't have anything to say about it. Normally, if they would, so someone would come from Prussia to the United States and naturalize in the United States, then they would be considered to have automatically lost their Prussian citizenship. These treaties were helpful, but they didn't completely solve the problem. And by 1928, there was a joint resolution of Congress begging the president to please take action and finally solve this problem. This is the joint resolution. And so the president did. And there was over a 50-year period when the United States tried to negotiate these treaties. But there was one holdout, Switzerland. The United States approached Switzerland at least 5 times over 50 years, saying, please, we need to have this treaty with you. And Switzerland said no. Now, what's the reason Switzerland gave? Switzerland said, our Constitution protects Swiss citizenship, and it says that you cannot lose Swiss citizenship unless you voluntarily go through a very specific process to give it up. And so we cannot conclude this treaty with you, United States, because it would violate our Constitution. And the United States ridiculed Switzerland for this and said that they were the ones practicing the doctrine of perpetual allegiance. But what actually happened, and I'm skipping over a lot of things here for the sake of time, what actually happened was in the 50s and 60s, the US Supreme Court adopted a series of cases that basically came around to the Swiss position and said, yeah, this is right. People should not be automatically losing their citizenship by operation of law. They should only lose it because they actively take steps to give it up. And in fact, this is the position of the United States. This is why the Bancroft treaties have all been terminated. And today, of course, military service is not the issue it was because fewer countries conscript. But there are treaties in place today, and what they provide for in terms of military service is they say if you have a dual citizen, then that person only has to serve in one country, probably the country where they live. But it does not require that person to give up one of their citizenships. That's now the accepted international solution to this issue. So I want to focus on this. This is what the Americans at the time said, as I've paraphrased it into modern language. People should be allowed to leave one country for another without prospective or future obligations to the country that they've left. Now I want to talk about the second tale of immigration, which is immigration from the United States, 20th century and today. And what you actually see in the U.S. tax code, you're smiling, you must have known I was coming here, is you see that the United States, this is an excerpt from a Treasury regulation, basically says the United States taxes it's not just its residents, which all countries do, on their worldwide income, but also taxes its citizens on their not U.S. source income or just U.S. source income, but on their worldwide income. So you can live outside the United States, have your income outside the United States, have your retirement and your investments all outside the United States, and the U.S. will tax it as if it was in the United States. And why is this a problem? It's a problem for 2 reasons. Number one, when you live out in another country, you're subject to the tax system of that country too, obviously. And so you end up living under 2 tax systems, which are never compatible. What one country will favor, the other one will not favor, and vice versa. And the other problem is that the U.S. tax code penalizes practically everything that is foreign. Foreign retirement plans, foreign investments, foreign home ownership, business ownership, bank accounts. And so basically, if you're living as an American outside of the United States, it's very difficult to live because of the U.S. tax code. And people, they have a lot of difficulties, as I've listed here, saving for retirement, investments, owning a home, operating a business, having a bank account. And there's really only 2 solutions to this problem. Move back to the U.S. or renounce, give up your U.S. citizenship. And so this is a chart showing how you can see basically since a banking law called FATCA was adopted, you can see how the renunciations of U.S. citizenship have just shot up. It's now quite common, and it can be quite difficult to get an appointment in a U.S. consulate to renounce. That's how many Americans are renouncing their U.S. citizenship. Not because they want to, but because they feel they have no choice. Now, the question this slide seeks to answer is, what's been the reaction of other countries to this? We saw in the previous story that the United States tried to step up and protect its immigrants, tried to take some action to protect their immigrants. And what are other countries, the countries where Americans live, what are they doing in this situation? Well, basically not a lot to actually helping the United States to entrench this system. I have some quotes here from some European Union authorities, and one, since we're in the UK, I got a quote from a UK member of parliament, where essentially the EU and the UK authorities have said, the United States is free to do what they want with their citizens. They can tax them however they want, and it has nothing to do with us, even if those people live in our countries. And then I've put in the middle here, FATCA. FATCA is the banking law adopted in 2010 that I mentioned. It requires banks to identify their American citizen clients and report them to American authorities. And here, other countries have actively gone out to help the United States enforce this law against Americans living outside the United States by concluding intergovernmental agreements with the U.S. So not only, they haven't just acquiesced, they've actively taken steps to entrench U.S. policies in their countries. So I want to talk about two things now, some parallels between these two systems, these two immigration stories, and then some lessons. So the first parallel, you might come along and say, well, conscription and taxes, military service and taxes, those are two completely different things. You're comparing apples to oranges. Well, I would tell you that these are only a selection of the quotes that I found of members of the US Congress over a period of more than 100 years, equating conscription to taxation, basically saying taxation is conscription of money, and taxation is conscription of money, and conscription is taxation of men, essentially. But yeah, these are quotes from 1869 through 1977, basically saying that. So we are not comparing apples to oranges. We're talking about two very, very similar things. So here's one parallel in these two immigration stories is people forcibly losing their citizenship. Whether they want to lose it or not, it's not the point. They're being forced into a situation where they're losing their citizenship. You've got in both stories, you've basically got an immigrant's country of origin that will not let the person go. They're finding a way to hold on to them, to keep them obligated to that country. Now, some lessons. These are the quotes that I gave you before from these diplomats from the 1860s, saying people from other countries who live in the United States should be free of their prospective and future obligation. Now you've got, for instance, these two gentlemen, they published quite a bit to defend the current tax system of the United States. And they're essentially saying here what Blackstone said. Once an American citizen, always American citizen, and your obligations remain. Fiscal citizenship he calls it an emerging notion, but it's exactly what Blackstone, under which an individual is obligated to the national, political, what's the rest of that? Political community of which he is a member, even if living outside the borders of that nation. The duty to pay tax follows from the concept of fiscal citizenship. It's the doctrine of perpetual allegiance. That's all it is. How come it's not changing? Oh, because I'm on that. Okay. I move up. No. Click there. Okay. So here's, I think, another lesson. In the 19th century, I think if you'd asked most people, they would have considered military service to be inseparable from citizenship, at least for men. Inconceivable to separate the two. But of course, today, these countries in blue are the countries with the year that they abolished their obligatory military service. So clearly, that's an ancient concept. We don't now today equate military service and citizenship, and we're able to separate those two. And so my point here is that if citizenship does have obligations, and that is a discussable point, but if it does, those obligations are not immutable. They change over time. The next lesson is that the United States can and must separate taxation from citizenship. As I said before, it seemed inconceivable before to separate military service. And today, most countries in the world don't tax their overseas citizens on their worldwide income. Not taxing your citizens on their worldwide income is the international norm. The United States is quite unique in the way it taxes its overseas citizens. So it's quite easy to conceive of not doing what the United States does. The other reason is renunciation of citizenship. It's not the solution to the problem. Citizenship is a human right, and returning to your country is also a human right. When you renounce your citizenship, you've given up your right to return to your country. So I think you have to categorically reject the suggestion just give up your American citizenship. And then my final lesson here is that immigrants, you cannot assume that an immigrant's going to be safe from their country of origin. And when they're not, they probably will remain unprotected until the country that they've moved to step up to try and protect them. And finally, it's time for the United States to let their citizens go. And that's the end. Thank you very much. And from now into the program, we've got Emily, right? Okay.